I'm Carol Massar, Bloomberg TV and Radio, and I'm delighted to have with me Michael Chertoff. He is co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group, and of course, former secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and that was during the George W. Bush administration. Michael, it is so great to have you here with us. I feel like this conversation is so timely when I think about the SolarWinds cyber attack last year. That was a massive attack. We had a Microsoft Exchange email attack as well. Colonial Pipeline, that was just last month, shutting down the biggest fuel pipeline in the U.S. And then you also had last month JBS's U.S. beef plants forced to really shut down. And we also had some international operations of that company impacted as well. It feels like the attacks are getting more severe and more frequent. How would you classify what's happening right now?
Well, Carol, I would agree with you. We're seeing the severity and the scale of the attacks and the frequency dramatically increasing. And if you go back a number of years, we mainly worried about the issue of theft of money, impersonation of identity, theft of intellectual property, espionage. That still continues, but now we are seeing more and more disruptive and destructive attacks, including those that have an effect on critical infrastructure and are really touching people in their everyday lives. So this is clearly increasing as a more serious national security issue.
What are the things that you hear about as you go about work at the Chertoff Group and you work with clients and you're working with governments, you're working with companies and institutions? What is it that they're also seeing on a regular basis?
Well, I think the biggest recent story is ransomware, which is, of course, infecting a network with an encryption that locks down all of the data and then saying, if you don't pay me money in Bitcoins, I'm going to throw the key away and you'll never get your data back. And that has the potential to be hugely disruptive. There have been hundreds of attacks on healthcare institutions, and those attacks of ransomware make it impossible to actually carry out necessary medical things. Colonial Pipeline was a ransomware attack. A Brazilian meat company was a ransomware attack. So that is the emerging new threat. But we continue to see the old-fashioned theft of money and identity impersonation as well.
You know, it's interesting, Michael, we've been having a conversation here at Bloomberg on our print side and editorial side about ransomware specifically. Is there a technical solution to ransomware? Specifically, could we do something where security software can detect ransomware as it's being detonated before, it causes all the problems?
Well, in one sense, ransomware is no different than any other attack. You're basically infecting the network in some traditional fashion, whether it's phishing, manipulating people into downloading something, or exploiting a vulnerability in the supply chain like you have in SolarWinds. The only difference is in ransomware, instead of simply stealing data, although they often steal data as well, you're infusing it with the encryption. So the prevention of ransomware is really a species of preventing any kind of attack. But the one difference is this. It's important to have resilience. If you've backed up your data, if the backup data is not accessible over the internet to the ransomware attackers, then it is relatively easy to reconstitute your missing data, and therefore you're not in that much of a bind. If you haven't backed up your data in real time, then it can become absolutely fatal to your business, and that's why people have been paying huge amounts of money.
Are people really backing up their data? You and I, in our prep call for this, we were talking about how companies have been very lean and mean, cutting costs, just in time, just doing things when they need it. And in many ways, Wall Street has certainly applauded that move, and we've seen that play out in the financial markets. But I do wonder, are a lot of companies, institutions, governments really prepared for maybe the cyber attacks to come?
Well, Carol, you're absolutely right. For many years, the mantra in the business community was lean and mean, just in time, don't have any excess capacity. That keeps costs down and it makes us hyper efficient. The flip side of hyper efficiency is you are vulnerable if something happens and now you don't have a plan B. You either don't have an alternative way to carry out your mission, or you don't have an alternative way to store your data. So I do think it's causing businesses and governments to rethink whether they need to build in a margin of safety and a margin of security against the possibility of some kind of a disaster. And by the way, let me say the pandemic has been a lesson in the same principle, that you've got to have a backup plan, because sometimes either Mother Nature or criminals wind up interfering with your plan A.
Well, let's talk about who's actually doing the cyber attacks at this point. We know we saw the summit between Presidents Biden and Putin, and Biden pretty much laying out that he understands that there are things going on in Russia that possibly, likely, that the President Putin is aware of. That's part of the problem. Governments know there's stuff going on in their countries, and they're kind of allowing it.
Well, some governments are allowing it. Now, with the Russians, we've seen two types of bad actors. We've seen the SVR, the Russian intelligence service, which was behind the SolarWinds hack into the supply chain. But we've also seen criminal groups, organized criminal groups based in Russia, carrying out attacks in other countries. And essentially, the tacit or even explicit understanding in Russia is, if you're a criminal group, as long as you carry out your crimes outside of Russia's borders, the Russian authorities will leave you alone. And they do that because sometimes they go to these very criminal groups and enlist them to carry out attacks with a national security element. We saw that, for example, in 2007 in Estonia, where criminal groups acting at the behest of Russia attacked the Estonian government and the Estonian financial system. So I think President Biden was quite right to be clear to Putin that we know it's not just the intelligence agencies themselves, but it's the fellow travelers in Russia that are carrying out a lot of these most devastating attacks.
And do you think governments need to be ready to launch a cyber attack back, basically go on offensive if they are attacked?
Well, that raises the critical issue of deterrence. And up to now, we've typically done things like brought criminal cases or imposed sanctions, which have a certain amount of deterrent impact, but not really as much as we need given what's going on now. And therefore, I think we need to get to the point that there is a cyber response when there is an attack. And that may mean disabling the attacker's servers or otherwise interfering with the attacker's conduct of operations. And maybe most important, follow the money. If you can get the money back, that is a major blow to the criminal groups. And one of the great stories out of Colonial Pipeline is the FBI was able to track the cryptocurrencies that were used to pay the ransom and get most of that money back. And if we can do that, that's going to be a major dent into the incentives these groups have.
Yeah, that certainly felt like a game changer, I know, from our perspective and just kind of watching it all happen. What, Michael, can governments do, institutions do, organizations do, governments in particular, to really protect themselves?
Well, we have to be cooperating, and that means we need to give each other information when there is an attack, data about the nature of the attack, and also some help about how do we wind up responding efficiently. Government needs to continue to share and increase the sharing of information, but the private sector needs to be incentivized to do the same as well. In some areas like the energy sector or the financial sector, there actually are regulatory incentives to require sharing. And the Biden administration just issued a new executive order for those dealing with the federal government that requires there be sharing of standards, sharing of information about attacks. And that is a great model for the private sector in general. So I do think the Biden administration has really stepped up now in terms of increasing the way in which we cooperate to defend ourselves and also potentially impose a deterrent effect on bad actors.
Hey, Michael, one last question, just got under a minute here. Have we seen the worst of it when it comes to cyber attacks, or are you kind of getting ready for the big one?
I'm afraid we haven't seen the worst. And I think particularly as tensions heat up geopolitically, we may actually see attacks that are direct on critical infrastructure. We've seen Russian reconnaissance on our electric grid. They haven't done anything, but of course you have to ask, why are they looking? And that's why we need to have the capability to make it clear that a response that causes a loss of life or very serious economic damage will, in our view, be the initiation of a hybrid conflict, and we will respond forcefully and unequivocally.